Hello and welcome to the Platt Institute webinar. I'm Adam Weinberg, Communications and Outreach Director here at the Platt Institute. Thank you for joining us for our new discussion on measuring prosperity in Nebraska. We're very fortunate to have guests joining us from the United Kingdom at the Legatum Institute. Our guests are Sean Flanagan, the Director of the Center for Metrics at the Legatum Institute, and Ed Wickstead. He's the Research Analyst at the Legatum Institute. Legatum specializes in indexes of measuring prosperity in countries and now the United States, states, and counties around our great country. And so I'm pleased to have them joining us today to discuss the findings in their United States Prosperity Index, which you can find online at usprosperity.net if you'd like to follow along as we have today's discussion. Also, today's program is going to be recorded and you'll be able to find it later at plattinstitute.org/podcasts. I'd like now to turn it over to Ed, who's going to give us an intro about the Legatum Institute Prosperity Index process. And then we'll talk a bit more with Sean and Ed about how it fits into the findings for Nebraska. Gentlemen, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Adam, for such a warm introduction, and good afternoon to all of you. As Adam mentioned, my name is Ed Wickstead, and I am a researcher at the Legatum Institute. And before we jump into what the United States Prosperity Index tells us about Nebraska, we thought it would be useful to explain who we are, to make sure we're all on the same page with regards to the term prosperity, and finally to give you a brief overview of the index itself. So firstly, who are we? The Legatum Institute is a London-based think tank, and our overarching mission is to create a global movement of people committed to creating pathways from poverty to prosperity for individuals, communities, and nations alike. To achieve this, we've spent the last 14 years developing our expertise in tracking, measuring, and analyzing what makes countries prosperous, and then working across the globe to bring together experts and policymakers to formulate data-driven policy responses. In addition to our global prosperity index, we produce a number of thematic and geographic indexes and data sets, and we've published an extensive range of in-depth country case studies, all aimed at helping leaders around the world develop practical solutions that will help people to thrive. And the United States Prosperity Index is a key part of that transformational product suite. So that's a brief overview of who we are and what we do. And now the second point, which is all about what is prosperity. And I'm sure for many of you, as it was for me, the term prosperity has a strong connotation of material wealth and financial well-being. However, this unidimensional view misses out so many of the things that we believe are so crucial to a fulfilling life. And to expose some of our ideas, we've prepared a short video for you, which we'll share with you now.
Prosperity is much more than mere wealth or economic growth. True prosperity is when all people have the opportunity to thrive. In a prosperous society, people live in peace, free from the threat of violence, oppression, and crime. Everyone's inherent dignity is respected, and all are free to vote, to protest, and to follow their beliefs. Governing institutions in every sector act with truth and integrity and are subject to the rule of law. And there are stable families and supportive communities that instill the values that shape the culture and build the bonds of trust needed for society to flourish. Prosperity is driven by an open economy that harnesses ideas and talent to foster employment and productivity and create sustainable pathways out of poverty. In a prosperous nation, open markets and high-quality infrastructure facilitate trade and commerce. There is a strong investment environment and effective business regulation that enables entrepreneurship, competition, and innovation. And people have the opportunity to work, to earn, to save, to take risks, and to succeed. Prosperity is built by empowered people who choose to live in right relationship with one another and create a society in which everybody is able to build a life free from poverty. People take care of their physical and mental well-being and can rely on a healthcare system that will take care of them when they need it. Learning is valued and everyone receives a high-quality education so they can write their own futures. And the natural environment is stewarded wisely as a legacy for present and future generations. Prosperity means everyone has the opportunity and freedom to fulfill their unique potential and take responsibility for contributing to their communities and nations. Because ultimately, prosperity is not just what we have on the outside. It is also about who we become on the inside. True prosperity is a life well lived.
Hopefully that came through clearly for everyone, but I know that videos on Zoom can be a little temperamental, so I've posted a link to the full video in the chat. So now that we're all on the same ground when it comes to what we are talking about when we talk about prosperity, the next question, I suppose, is how do we measure it? And I know on the screen you'll see quite a complex diagram, but don't worry if you can't read all of the text. We'll start by looking at the innermost ring. And here we have our what we call our domains of prosperity. So on the inclusive societies domain, which is on the left and in the blue, is all about capturing the relationship structures that exist within a society between and among individuals and broader institutions, and the degree that they either enable or obstruct societal cohesion. The open economies domain, in the center in the orange, captures the extent to which an economy is open to competition, encourages innovation and investment, promotes business and trade, and facilitates inclusive growth. And last but by no means least is the empowered people domain on the right, which captures the quality of people's lived experience and the associated aspects that enable individuals to reach their full potential through autonomy and self-determination. And within each of these domains, we have more specific pillars of prosperity, which are slightly more granular. So walking again from the left of the diagram to the right, this is the second concentric ring. We start with the safety and security pillar. And this assesses whether people are able to live in peace from the threat of violence, oppression, crime, forms of violent crime. The personal freedom pillar looks at whether the freedoms of speech, worship, and assembly are protected. The governance pillar looks at whether governing institutions act with integrity and are accountable to their citizens and subject to the rule of law. The social capital pillar looks at the strength of families and supportive communities, and the extent to which the values that are instilled that shape the culture and build the bonds of trust are there, and those bonds that are needed for society to flourish. Now, moving on to the open economies domain, we have three pillars. First of these is the business environment pillar, and this looks at a number of things, but crucially looks at whether business regulation enables rather than hinders entrepreneurship, competition, and innovation, and whether startups and small businesses have access to finance that they need to grow. In the center, we look at the market access and infrastructure pillar. This assesses whether markets are open and whether the high quality infrastructure is there that facilitates trade and commerce, like good quality roads and reliable electricity. And finally, we look at the economic quality pillar. This looks at whether fiscal and monetary policy are used responsibly to foster employment, productivity, and sustained growth. So it looks at things like how productive the workforce is and the levels of unemployment in the population. In the empowered people domain, we have And this measures the degree to which a reasonable quality of life is experienced by all, including looking at poverty rates and access to housing and basic services. Our health pillar looks at the health of the population, not just their illness and behavioral risk factors such as obesity and smoking, but also access to the services that are needed to maintain good health. We also look at outcomes, both physical and mental health, as well as the quality of the care systems. Our education pillar looks at the access to and quality of education, right the way through from pre-K through to tertiary education and the education level of the adult population. And finally, the natural environment pillar measures the aspects of the physical environment that have an immediate impact on people in their daily lives, such as exposure to fine particulate matter, and also those aspects that impact the prosperity of future generations. Now, that's a brief overview, and underpinning each of these pillars, as you can see on the outermost ring of this diagram, we have a number of what we call elements. Now, we developed these in conjunction with a number of experts coming from a wide range of policy areas and from right the way across the US, and have designed to specifically be very policy focused. So to summarize, we have an index of the 50 states and the District of Columbia that's been specifically structured to be useful to policymakers. And these 48 policy-focused elements are organized into the 11 pillars of prosperity and are underpinned by more than 200 separate indicators from a wide array of sources, with data ranging back up to 10 years, allowing for comparisons of improvement and deterioration. And before I hand over to Sean, we wanted to share with you another video which outlines the key findings from this year's report.
The United States Prosperity Index provides a holistic picture of how prosperity was distributed across the 50 states of the Union and Washington, D.C., as well as 829 counties in 8 selected states for the 10 years preceding the coronavirus pandemic. It shows that, prior to COVID-19, U.S. prosperity had been rising and was at its highest ever level. However, prosperity was not equally distributed across the country. Northern states outperformed those in the South, with Massachusetts topping the rankings and Mississippi at the bottom. Prosperity was also distributed very differently within individual states. While some states, like Iowa, saw similar levels of prosperity across all counties, others, like California, had much greater variation and represented a microcosm of the U.S. as a whole. Broadly speaking, urban counties were more prosperous than their rural counterparts, but rural counties were safer and had stronger social networks, while urban counties had better economic performance and social well-being. The growth in America's prosperity was mainly driven by more open economies. Among other factors, states became more productive and improved their fiscal sustainability. For example, Wyoming increased its financial reserves by over 300%, so could survive for 280 days longer by 2020 than 10 years earlier. Living conditions, health, education, and the natural environment had all also improved since 2010. But while the US has seen improvements over the last decade, which can provide a strong foundation as the country charts its way out of the COVID-19 pandemic and grapples with civil unrest, there are warning signs at national, state, and local levels that need to be addressed. The weakening of social capital is a serious threat to future prosperity, as strong and inclusive communities and institutions are the cornerstones of society. Across the US, social networks, trust in institutions, and civic and social participation have all weakened. For example, in Missouri, time spent volunteering fell by almost 1/3, from an average of 37 hours to 26 hours per person. Mental health had also deteriorated significantly in the decade before the pandemic started, and there had been a large rise in the number of suicides and drug overdose deaths, particularly in areas such as West Virginia and Colorado, with Pueblo County especially badly affected. Education had also weakened in the last year, with states such as Alaska, Montana, and North Dakota seeing a decline in test scores for reading, math, and science in the 4th and 8th grades. This is a concern as the pandemic resulted in many school closures, which may exacerbate further decline. Our analysis shows that the key to unlocking greater prosperity lies in the potential for improvement at a state and county level, and not just nationally. By learning from and building upon each other's strengths, every U.S. state and county can further develop inclusive societies, open economies, and empowered people, and drive greater levels of prosperity for all Americans.
Well, hello, everybody. It's great to be with you. Special thank you to Adam for having us on today. We're super excited to be here virtually with you in Nebraska. We have earlier in the year actually been doing a bit of a roadshow around the US, and we have the privilege and pleasure of joining a number of organizations on the East Coast. We started off, I'll have to wrap my brain now, but we were up in Massachusetts, and then we came down to DC, to New York, and then we came across to Georgia, to Oklahoma, and ended in Texas. And we were hoping to come back for the second part of our tour in April, but unfortunately something called COVID-19 stopped us. Otherwise we would love to have been with you in person. But it's great to be with you today. And as Adam said, my name's Sean Flanagan. I'm director of the Center for Metrics, and have the privilege of leading the team that produces all our indexes, both global and the US one. So what I want to take really is just the next few minutes of going from that sort of what Ed has really helpful laid out through our video about what is it what we mean by prosperity, and then how do we measure it, through to the key findings showing the sort of macro level findings of what we've seen through the index this year. And now I want to hone in even a bit further to talk about Nebraska. What is the index saying about Nebraska? Now, this hopefully some of it will chime with what you hopefully will already know to help build confidence, and may offer one or two things that perhaps you didn't know. So without further ado, let's dive in. So this slide here really just shows how Nebraska performs in the index overall, and how's that changed since 2010. So the overall ranking, when you add all these 216 indicators, 11 pillars, 48 policy-focused elements, 3 domains, we find that Nebraska ranks 16th overall. So it's a little bit below Maryland, but above Rhode Island. But when you cast your eyes across to the right of the table and have a look at how Nebraska performs in the different pillars of prosperity, you see there's quite a mixed performance. And this isn't unusual for Nebraska. Pretty much every state has strongest performing pillars and weaker performing pillars. And in fact, one of the key findings really was that there was no single state that was performing well on all pillars of prosperity, and therefore has the opportunity not just to improve, but also to learn perhaps from another state that's stronger as a way of improving its performance. So with Nebraska, we see that it ranks well on social capital. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And health, where it ranks 7th, and governance, it ranks 10th. But then moving across, you see that it ranges from 19th on safety and security, 31st for market and access and infrastructure. And its weakest performing pillar is around the natural environment. So how has prosperity changed in Nebraska over the past decade? So the chart on the right just shows you how prosperity has fluctuated. And what we see is Nebraska outperforms not just the overall US as a whole, but also its cluster of states in the Midwest. And its performance has sort of fluctuated a little bit. Its best performing ranking was 13th in 2014, but it's now fallen a little bit to 16th. But over the past decade, you see that prosperity has improved and strengthened in the state. And then on the right-hand side, what you can see is across those 11 pillars is what has led to that change, what has driven that improvement. And we see that it's principally coming from the open economies domain, business environment, quality, and I'll talk a bit more about business environment in a moment. And then actually it's had quite a strong improvement in the empowered people domain across those 4 pillars. When we look at the inclusive societies, we see that actually it's whilst it's improved in safety and security, in social capital, it's one of those many states that actually saw a weakening of social capital over the past decade. But if we look at an area of strength in terms of best ranking pillars, we can look at social capital. Yes, it has seen a deterioration since 2010. But actually, when we look across the 4 elements that make up social capital, that's personal and family relationships, those are those relations really at the core of our lives, that those close friends and family relationships. And then in concentric circles, widening out social networks, those sort of relationships to do with neighbors, but also trust in strangers. And then the next element, which I wanted to talk about, is institutional trust. So this is the sort of social contract really between individuals and those institutions. And we see that actually Nebraska has seen a big improvement in this over the past decade. And then civic and social participation is that extent to which people get engaged with, volunteer, religious and non-religious communities and organizations. So if we look at institutional trust, and we're going down now to the lowest level of the index, these are the indicators that make up institutional trust. So we're looking here, what is the confidence that people have in corporations? What is the confidence that they have in the media? And what is the confidence that they have or trust in the federal government? One of the things we did look at trying to find for this particular element was trust in state government. And actually we did find that Gallup had done a collection of data but only for 1 year. So we haven't included that. But that is, if anyone knows of a really good indicator around trust in state government, then do let us know, because we'd love to include that in here to strengthen this further. But we see across these that actually it's seen an improvement, which actually, I don't know if you remember from the video, institutional trust was one of the things that for the US as a whole has deteriorated. So here we see that Nebraska is bucking the trend. Again, one of the areas where we see Nebraska as having improved is in its business environment. So this, as I've talked through already, captures a number of different things. The first one really looking at the financing ecosystem. So how well equipped is the state for attracting finances, which is particularly important for businesses both to start, but also to grow and develop. And we see when we look at the business environment pillar, it's actually had a big increase, now ranks 19th overall, and has risen 11 places in the rankings. So seen a strong improvement, and that's being partly driven by the improvement in financing ecosystems. So if we again just look at the indicators that measure that, we capture a number of things here around venture capital, assets under management, but also bank branch access. And we see on venture capital, we see that this is an area where Nebraska has improved over the past decade, so quite a big improvement in its score, and it's risen 7 places in the rankings. Now that will come back to a little bit later, but that obviously is really important, as it says at the top, is sort of increased finance to help businesses. But if we look at some other areas where Nebraska could perhaps see some improvement, and what we're trying to do here is just tell a bit of a narrative through the data, through the quantitative data that are in the index. Now, obviously, this is really helpful to help shine a light, a spotlight, if you like, on certain areas, but it needs to be supported by local contextual information as well. So the index is not going to tell you what to do, but it helps illuminate those areas perhaps that need investment or interrogation. And we see here on burden of regulation, which is also within the business environment, we see that Nebraska ranks 41st for this, and is actually seen a deterioration in its score over the past decade. It's held its position. So what goes into the burden of regulation? And we actually pilfer 2 indexes here. One is the State Regulation Index, and the other is the Federal Regulation State Enterprise Index, as a way of capturing how regulation is set up within the state. And we see on the Federal Regulation and State Enterprise Index that actually Nebraska ranks 47th. So there's something here around the regulation which is potentially holding back further progress. Perhaps as an area to look into, delve a bit deeper but could this be an area where perhaps relaxing some of the regulation may help? We also see, when we look at one of the other economic pillars on market access and infrastructure, whilst Nebraska does really well, it ranks first on resources. So that's looking at access to electricity, stable, reliable, but also access to water to help businesses. We see that actually it does really well. But on the flip side, we see on communications, we see that actually Nebraska doesn't perform so well, and it's actually seen a slight deterioration since 2010, falling 2 places in the rankings. And what we're trying to capture in the communications element is really the sort of digital connectivity. So looking at things like mean download speed, access to ultra fast and high speed internet. And we see on some of these indicators, so mean download speed doesn't perform particularly well relative to other states. On high speed internet access, we see that actually the percentage of the population that has access to that has fallen very slightly since 2010, where in lots of other states we will have seen an improvement, and so it's fallen in the rankings. So again, communications is potentially an area that could be strengthened. So just to land really on the sort of state level findings. So what we're sort of seeing here is we're seeing actually increased finances being made available over the past decade, which seems to be a very good thing to help support businesses. But there's a couple of things really which may be areas for investigation and change around regulation, around communication, because what we're also seeing in the dynamism element, and this is one of the elements within economic quality, is actually when we look at startups and we look at entrepreneurships, we actually see that there's not been much movement. And in fact, if anything, there's been a slight weakening in these areas. So startup concentration has fallen, but also when we look at patent applications, whilst they've improved relative to other states, and it ranks in the middle around rate of entrepreneurs. So by addressing these weaknesses areas, these sort of regulation, by looking at sort of improving communications, could actually provide a bit of a catalyst for new businesses to attract new businesses. And I know when we were presenting in Oklahoma, we were working with presenting, co-hosting with I think it was the McCombs Business School there, which is part of Oklahoma University. We actually found that they had their big focus was around entrepreneurship, startups. And lo and behold, when we look at the data over the past 10 years, we see that actually that is an area that had improved. So what I've just tried to do in these few slides is talk a little bit at a state level where we're seeing some areas for improvement, some areas that could be strengthened, perhaps some items for discussion afterwards. I just wanted to land really on our county level index, because to sort of herald, if you like, that Nebraska counties are coming soon. So at the moment, this year, we stood up a county level index for 8 selected states, as shown here, and also discussed briefly in the key findings video. We're also going to be adding 4 new states in this coming year. Ed and the team are going to be beavering away between now and July. And we will be adding the 369 counties in Florida, Minnesota, Kentucky, and also Nebraska. And that will then provide complementary information at a much more targeted and localized level to really see whether things are, do these areas that need to invest, are they located in particular areas, or are they statewide? And that will be the benefit of having the state level and county level analysis together. Just to conclude, we want to say, and this, Adam kindly mentioned this at the beginning, but all of this information is available on our dedicated website, usprosperity.net. There is a map at state level and also county level for where we've got county information. You can interact with the maps, you can select the pillars of prosperity that you want to view, but also there is a profile for every single state, including Nebraska, which provides the full transparency of all aspects of the index, from the domains to the pillars to the elements, all the way down to the indicators and how it has changed over the past decade. So you can really drill down to help understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of each of these areas and what perhaps needs to be investigated further. So thank you very much for listening. I will now stop sharing my screen and over to Adam.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you, Ed. And I was excited to have you on. The more I checked out usprosperity.net and the metrics that you've gathered for Nebraska, and especially that you're going to be looking at county level data, should be very interesting for our state, because our state is currently, like a lot of states and a lot of people, especially after the year we've had, we're engaged in a process kind of soul searching and visioning for the future of where is Nebraska's place in a very quickly changing global landscape. And we have in our state a unicameral system of state government that requires a really large degree of consensus. And I see in some of the measurements in your index that you've got some measurements that will really make one group of constituents pay very close attention. And you've got another group of measurements that'll make another group of constituents pay very close attention. But really, when you want to look holistically at these issues, you have to figure out how do you combine all of these into a strategy that helps your state be prosperous and attractive for all of these groups of residents. And so what is some of your thought as you've traveled our country and talked to other groups globally with your index, advice you would have? And why is it that Legatum Institute started taking an interest in this? And folks, not to delay the answer, but if you'd like to ask a question of Sean and Ed, you're more than welcome to in the Q&A section. We'll get to your questions through the program.
I'll take the easy part of that question, and then I'll hand the tricky bit to Ed. So very good question as to why, Adam. I'd touch on that briefly, if I may. So we've been doing our global index for about 14 years, and we published our 2020 index quite recently. And the US is very interesting when we look across the different pillars of prosperity. It wouldn't come as any surprise to anybody listening that when we look at the open economies part of the index, the US is right up there at the top. It often ranks third or fourth, and it's often behind only countries like Singapore, which are much, much smaller. And therefore, the fact that the US is able to rank fourth is incredible. And remember, in the open economies, we're not measuring economic output. We're measuring how dynamic and open an economy is, which is slightly different, but nonetheless. But when we look across some of the other pillars of prosperity, we see that actually the US doesn't perform as strongly, particularly things like safety and security and health, where both of which it ranks in the high 50s. And that led us to really wanting to understand why. And so we actually were funded to do this work through the Helmsley Charitable Trust, which principally has a interest in rural health. But they really want, as we talked to them about rural health and the social determinants of health, they actually wanted us to do an index of the 50 states of the Union in DC, and then to ideally do sub-state to really understand and noodle what's going on. So that's a bit of background as to why we came to the US, is to really understand how prosperity, particularly some of those areas of perhaps more weakness, were translating across the 50 states of the Union.
Yeah, and I will jump in on the difficult bit now. Thanks, Sean. I think it's a really interesting question. And when I think about it, I'm actually thinking back to a webinar that Sean and I did on specifically rural health just a couple of days ago. And one of the big questions there was, well, why is nutrition, for example, which is one of our elements, why is that in the living conditions element pillar and not in the health pillar? Because it's so clearly related to health. And that was a whole process that we went through for almost all of the elements in the index, in discussion with principally our global experts in determining the structure of the global index, and then again with our US experts. And I think the key takeaway is that, everything is so interconnected. And in some ways, the real beauty and the strength of the index is that all of these things are measured along the same kind of dimensions. We've taken indicators and data sources from a wide range of different places with a wide range of different measurements. And we've said, right, we think based on the literature, based on our expert opinions, based on, our intuitions, that these 5 or 6 indicators are going to be a really good proxy for, how strong our care, healthcare systems in this place, or to what degree is there a high level of social tolerance, for example. But these elements are all measured along the same dimension. So what you can do is actually say, well, you know what? nutrition and physical health outcomes are actually really, really strongly correlated. And so to perhaps take one example, in the report that we just produced this year, we were looking at particularly one of the problems that is become so obviously pervasive across large swathes of the US is rural internet connectivity. And what the index does is it allows you to say, well, you know what, Rock County in Minnesota, they focus specifically on developing their broadband infrastructure and connectivity. They basically focused all of their investment there. And you think, well, what about the healthcare systems, and what about focusing on business startups? And actually, what we get is from this data is, well, you can say, well, now 99.9% of Rock County's population has access to the internet. And as a result, the county's economic development office has capitalized on that. They've attracted businesses, they've established an e-visit scheme with a nearby hospital. So it's improved those healthcare outcomes for the residents of those counties. And I think that's the real beauty of the index and how it can help create consensus, even for very difficult subjects.
Broadband and telehealth, these certainly are major issues. It's interesting you use the word scheme. I know across the pond it has a different connotation than sometimes it does in the States, but I get where you're going with that. And it's a very good insight that these measurements, when we think holistically, one can impact the other. And I think that's been one of the bridges when you made a number of mention, gentlemen, of the business environment in Nebraska, which we generally think of as quite strong, but you mentioned that the burden of regulations, communications, which can tie back to issues like broadband, labor market flexibility, and financing ecosystems may be some of the areas that are not as strong as some of our other areas where we have an advantage. So when you look at these measurements, where do you think our leaders should look as far as examples for other states that have made strides in these areas? And more importantly, in a time where we're concerned about a K-shaped recovery, where there's a disparate impact of who's doing well and who's not in this environment, how do you focus on those improving in those areas that has widespread prosperity for everyone?
Sean, I think you're on mute still.
Oh yeah, Sean, sorry, you had something great to say, I'm sure, but we couldn't hear it.
I'm not so sure about that, Adam. You're too kind, but I'll have a go. I think what we're seeing through the index is that over the past decade, actually, the financing ecosystems is something that's been strengthening, and that is to be encouraged. And so we see that actually the state does seem to be attracting more venture capital. One of the areas it's not perhaps improved is around foreign direct investment. And actually one of the, because the index is structured in a way using the same indicators across all states and counties, you can therefore look across, it's comparable to really compare other places. And when we look at Ohio, for example, we see actually over the past decade that has seen quite a big improvement in FDI that it's been able to attract. And it has it's created its own economic development corporation, and there is perhaps a state to look at, because that is an area perhaps that Nebraska isn't quite perhaps doing as well as it could do to attract more finance from elsewhere, other than from elsewhere in the US, but outside of the US, that could be a particular area where it could look at.
Well, thank you. And we have some questions coming in, and you may submit your questions in the Q&A section. We'd be happy to take them during the program. And if we run out of time, of course, we'd be happy to connect you with our experts as well. Here's the first question, and I think Ed's going to take this. It's from Cody Ronfeld at WJAG Radio in Norfolk, Nebraska. It's Northeast Nebraska. He says, you may have mentioned it, but where'd you get the information from where you put the report for Nebraska together? Is it a difficult process to compile this information?
Yes, Cody, it's a little bit of a difficult process, but we've had 14 years of developing these quite complex indices. But for the USPI and importantly, not just for Nebraska, but also for the other 49 states and DC, we get information from a wide variety of sources. So I believe that we have more than 80 sources where we get our data from for this United States Prosperity Index. The vast majority of this is publicly available data. But the issue is, and why it's such a kind of complicated, well, perhaps the wrong way around, it's such a complicated process. So maybe that's why people haven't thought of kind of bringing these data sets together before in such a holistic way. I think you do get other indexes that are, the county health rankings, for example, the social progress index, but they tend to look at only one or two dimensions. Obviously, the county health rankings will only look at health, although they do include some health adjacent indicators. But we publish all of our full methodology on our website, including the list of all of the sources for all of the indicators that we have, as well as all of the transformations that we do to the data to make sure it's standardized. And those are available on our website. Or if you ping me an email, I'm happy to answer more questions if you have them.
Well, we'll see if there's room in the budget for that. Here's an additional question. It's related to the indicators, and I think this is a good one. Can you talk more about the indicators you looked at for Nebraska's poor performance in the area covering natural environment? And this is my own editorializing here. This is going to be one of the areas where I imagine, from just looking at it on the surface, we're a state that has abundant natural resources. We're an agricultural state where that plays very heavily into our prosperity and to our tradition as a state. At the same time, there is growing concern about the environmental impact of agriculture, food processing. And so those are things that as society changes, our producers and our industry are going to have to contend with, both politically and socially and culturally. And so those are questions of that you ask, can a state that has this strength also find ways to make up for what is perceived as a weakness and find a good path forward? Gentlemen, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, often an area of strength overutilized can become, a potential weakness. And the natural environment, I think, is one of those where it's about, allowing it to serve the needs of the current population, but whilst preserving it for future generations. So, agriculture is one of those ones which is a really difficult balance, because it requires the use of certain chemicals to help support agricultural production, but actually that has to be used in a way that doesn't affect the sort of curation of that for future generations. So when we look at I'm just looking now at the Nebraska natural environment, and what we look at here is we look at all the quality basically of all the different elements. So we look at air, and there we look at we look at what's being pumped into the air in terms of emissions, but we also look at the quality of the air through sort of exposure to air pollution. And there we look at DALY's number of life years lost from air pollutions, and also fine particulate matter. But we also look at the quality of the forest, the land, the soil, the fresh water, and the preservation efforts. And when I look at Nebraska's, to be honest, it has a bit of a mixed performance in terms of those different elements. It actually it's got a fairly good rating for when you look at toxic land releases on that particular indicator. It's seeming to do quite well. But when you look at sort of exposure to pesticides from the CDC, there it ranks 43rd. So we're seeing a bit of a mixed picture coming through. And then when we look at preservation efforts, particularly around the gap areas, that's how we capture that there. Again, it doesn't perform as strongly as other states. But just encourage people to interrogate and have a look at that in a bit more detail, and come back to us if you've got any further questions.
While we're waiting for some more questions to come in, one I had is these figures are based on 2020 and dates before. And so you've got pre-COVID numbers in here. You did make some mention in the video and content. It was very welcome that there's a lot that we have to discuss about the next normal, what will hopefully be a post-pandemic landscape sooner rather than later. But how would you account for the fact that a lot of these figures and a lot of the standing of perhaps even states is going to change really significantly from this global unprecedented event?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and in a way, if you like, the way I look at it is that the index is it's a little bit like looking in your rear view mirror. You can see where you've come from and where you are now. So what the index measures is the decade up until COVID hit, absolutely. But I think you can be probably fairly certain that where there was a weakness before, that weakness is going to remain, and probably to some extent, depending on the nature, will be further exacerbated by COVID-19. So, for example, one of the challenges we know, and I think, again, this comes back to what's a national issue, what's a state issue, what's a federal issue, what's a state issue, and what's a local issue. And mental health, for example, was definitely something we highlighted in the key findings video as being a national issue with the rise of suicides and drug overdose deaths. But also, that's going to be exacerbated considerably by the pandemic, because people's mental health, anxiety around the actual virus, but also, around the impact of it on jobs, on quality of life, that's going to be an area. But we can definitely look at different areas of the index and see they're going to be more impacted. And I think to what you were saying, Adam, a minute ago around, as Nebraska looks to sort of perhaps redefine itself or think about what it wants to be in the future, we also believe that the index provides a really useful framework upon which to build. So it provides a sort of blueprint to say, if you want to build a prosperous society, these are all the things that you need to take into account. Now, obviously, you can't take them all into account, but if it's a trajectory or a movement towards, then you can focus on those areas, one or two areas to start with, and then look to build further as you move forward. So it also provides a framework to build a more prosperous and flourishing society.
Thank you, Sean. I'm personally looking
I'll
for.
just jump in there, Adam.
Yeah, go for it, please.
Thanks. I was just going to say, you mentioned as well the impact of coronavirus is likely to have exacerbated a lot of the inequalities that we see across the whole of the United States, and that has been one of our kind of calls to action, is that we get our data as granular as we can get it, and we get as much information as we can, and we will look at these various inequalities, but quite frankly, that data is just not available enough for anyone really to make real use of it. So that is our kind of call to action, is for these kind of data providers to provide this data at a much more granular level, so that these impacts can be picked up on much more quickly, can be pinpointed with much more precision, and then acted upon.
Thanks, Ed. Yeah, it's been quite a learning year on so many fronts. And so it's useful to have this index, I think, because it doesn't look at only one dimension of what we're trying to accomplish as a state, as a society. And so that's one thing I really appreciated about your work and the opportunity to engage Nebraskans on talking about the whole picture of where we're trying to go in Nebraska for our future. Speaking of which, in 2020, we've had to reckon with a lot of fundamental questions about issues of personal freedom. And Nebraska, in your ranking, does very well in some what I'd call universal areas of personal freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. When you get to the idea of protecting personal freedom for vulnerable populations, which is always the trick with freedom, everybody likes freedom for themselves, but freedom for the other person, where does that come down? It seems like we have some concerns, particularly on your measurement of social tolerance. What is the basis for that? Of course, that's a sensitive subject where people, people get fragile when you talk about the idea that is an area where that needs to be a conversation and be improved. So how can we have that conversation? How can we improve in those rankings? And what would it mean for our growth potential as a state if we could?
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point, Adam, because I think one of the things we capture in the personal freedom is kind of freedom to speak, freedom to assemble, and that I think it's really important that we're able to have an honest debate around things, because I think that's I definitely know in the UK that perhaps that art of debating well is something that's been lost from society. No longer are we able to potentially have a debate with someone around an issue where we can walk away at the end and be good friends. The issue becomes very closely associated with the person, and if you If you, dislike the view, you dislike the person. And actually what we need to come back to is a much more honest way of debating and discussing that allows these healthy conversations, because otherwise I think what tends to happen is that people then entrench into their views, and then polarization takes place even more. And so you end up with these very polar views, which doesn't help. So what we're trying to capture in the personal freedom is a number of things. One is around agency. So how much agency does somebody have in terms of their freedom to be able to move, to be able, through no coercion. So trafficking is something that we capture in there. And then the next two elements really are around what is the kind of legal ramifications for freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to associate. Are there things around discrimination about in the employment sphere? Is there religious freedom? Is there around, particularly around perhaps the LGBT community? Are there discrimination laws that prohibit, discriminating against them? Now, all of those is kind of like a legal framework, which is important. But actually, what's also important is what's the lived experience of people. So what we've tried to create in the social tolerance is actually how do people feel in terms of the lived experience towards other groups in society. So that's where we're looking at things like same-sex marriage support, but also LGBT non-discrimination law support. So it's around those certain groups in society which can experience, discrimination. Is what do they have? And we've actually created our own index. Ed, picking up on what Ed was saying, was around one of the things we wanted to capture in the index was some measure of experience of racialism and racism. And actually, we couldn't find a measure, so we created our own, which was through this ethnic slurs that are searched for in Google traffic. We were able to create something, but we don't put all our eggs in that one basket, because we recognize that, and this is why we think the index is strong, is that there's a number of indicators per element. So we're not relying on one indicator. So we've got 4 different indicators within that particular element, all capturing slightly different things to try and present a holistic measure of what is sort of social tolerance towards other groups.
Thank you for that. And I'm interested to see, as your research in Nebraska continues, you're going to have county level data that expands upon your U.S. Prosperity Index. You've already done this in Colorado and in Iowa, and that's of great interest to Nebraskans because these are states in which we're placed in competition all of the time. Where I'm sitting right now, I could be in Iowa in maybe 10, 15 minutes. So it's a part of life and part of our thought process as far as how do we flourish, how do we compete with our neighboring states. Do you have any thoughts from looking at the data in these states and our neighbors and what they're doing? Any words of wisdom from a relative standpoint you share with us?
I'll share one, and then maybe Ed. So we were looking at, we were actually doing last Friday a webinar on Montana, and we were looking at the open economies domain in Montana. And actually, we see that in Montana, most of the 56 counties in Montana perform relatively weakly on that particular domain, and particularly on the economic quality pillar. So if you're a county in Montana, there doesn't seem to be, at least through the index, another county you can go to within your own state that perhaps you could learn from to help improve. So what we're able to do is compare across in Colorado at a rural state over there. Now, the danger obviously is this is where geography and knowledge is really important, because I could have picked one of the ones in the sort of in the middle up the north, but you'd be looking at places like Aspen then, and obviously that has huge opportunity because it's a ski resort. Not everywhere can become a ski resort. But I was looking across at Yuma County and just doing a little bit of research, and what they've been able to do there is they've created for that county like an economic development corporation, and they've got agriculture coming together, they've got business, they've got government. They've pulled together all the different sectors of society to have a sort of collaborative and holistic approach to tackling some of the challenges. And what you see, actually, they've made a number of improvements over the past decade. Now, I'm not attributing causality, but I'm saying that by perhaps creating these collaborations, these collaboratives, can be very, very powerful to help overcome some of the barriers and challenges that often are faced.
Yes, and of course, we're in the business of making policy that gives people greater opportunity. But of course, policy has to be implemented, communities have to be engaged, people have to see how they can access opportunity, and that has to be taught to people to become a regular practice and part of the community. So that is excellent advice, and one that, as I've read research on issues like entrepreneurship, that is something that certainly we'd like to take a closer look at, is how do you build that process so that you have people aware of the opportunities that are available, and you can have different kinds of innovation from every community. So thank you for that. It's so interesting to dive into the index and look at all of the thought that you provided. Of course, we can take pride that in many ways we rank well. We also have areas that we want to focus on and improve. Being that we do rank relatively well, do you want to leave any parting thoughts with us about what you've seen states that maybe started in a weaker position on some of these issues, where they went from to improve to a stronger position?
Ed, do you want to have a go at
Yes,
that?
yeah, sure. I can jump in there. Absolutely. I think first off, it's really important to celebrate that you've ranked well. I mean, sometimes I think, as you're alluding to, the temptation is to kind of say, yeah, we kind of beat you, South Dakota or whoever it is, and then kind of, right, well, we're done for the year. But I think what we've seen is that the pathway to prosperity is actually not the pathway to prosperity. There are many, many, many pathways to prosperity, and it's all about finding the one that's going to work for your community, for your state, or indeed for the whole of the US. And I think that's the important takeaway, is that yes, you are doing well, and you've got some areas that are really, really strong, such as social capital and governance, for example. And of course, you need to keep building on those and kind of export your ideas to other communities and states around the country. But you also need to kind of go back to South Dakota and say, well, to be fair, you're also doing slightly better on us than communications. What can we learn from you? So I think, yeah, the pathways are very, very complex, very multifaceted, but hopefully the index provides a way to get to those solutions quite quickly.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your research and your thoughts with us today. And thank you for those of you who tuned in and shared your questions. Of course, we'd be happy to make Sean and Ed available to you if you have additional questions. They'll be continuing to work on Nebraska as their county work continues. And I hope in a better time and a safer time soon, you can join us here in Nebraska, and we can talk more about these issues again in the future.
We'd love that. We'd love to come back. So thank you for having us.
Thank you
so much, Adam.
Thank you. And everyone, have a great day. Have a happy holiday season. Stay safe, and we'll see you all very soon.
Bye.